Cape Cod Broadcasting weaves the listening environments of 99.9 WQRC, Ocean 104.7, WFCC Classical 107.5, Cape Country 104, and CapeCon.com's website experience to reflect the lifestyles of the people who live, work, and play on Cape Cod. We hope that you enjoy this podcast.
I'm Laura Reckford, and this is Sunday Journal. I'm here in the studio with Marianne Agresti, an architect whose business is the Design Initiative here in Hyannis. Welcome, Marianne.
Thank you.
And Brian Dale, who is the Facilities Manager at the Cape Cod Regional Transit Authority. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Laura.
Now, we're talking about a very interesting new initiative here in Hyannis. Marianne, I think this came out of a sort of philosophy you were telling me about that you call spaces in between. Tell me about that.
The spaces between came from a research project where we were beginning to look at some really cool paths along the east part of Main Street in Hyannis. It's sort of a forgotten spot, the east part of Main Street in Hyannis. It's where my business is. It's where Brian works with the Transit Authority. And it occurred to us that there were some really amazing things that were there. Dominic Alessandra, who owns a property in that area, made us aware of some really unique historical and current events that were happening there. And it occurred to us that we should maybe do a project where we could highlight them for others.
And how did the two of you meet in order to start doing this project?
Yeah, well, we actually met at a meeting for the East End potential development or redevelopment, and we just actually met up with Dominic at that point, and Dominic gave us the story about the history of Pleasant Street and also the surrounding area.
So what was interesting to me, so we met at a meeting that was an official meeting of Main Street, right? Because they're really trying on their own right to develop Main Street. But when we were there, being at that end of Main as an architect, it seems fractured to me. It's a really fractured part of the world. It's a fractured part of Hyannis. And I never leave my office. I never go for walks. There really isn't anything to really entice me to do that. And then when I was introduced to Dom and he gave me a walk of his own perception of the neighborhood and made me aware that it was a nationally registered neighborhood historically as of 1987, my own architect's eyes were opened. And I realized that there were a lot of places that were between 2 points on the Cape. So we have the transportation center, which is a great point, and then we have the harbor or the ferry that is a great point. But the space between that thousands of people walked throughout the summer in an effort to catch their ferry or catch their bus or catch their train was sort of a lost place. It was this ligament that connected two places that people hadn't really paid a lot of attention to. And as an architect interested in the built environment, I think that on the Cape we could really highlight these moments and really use it as an economic engine for people to really become more aware of what's happened to the Cape over the past 100 years in a different way.
And for people who haven't walked around that area, it's an old and very beautiful section of town, actually, with some beautiful old buildings. But the development hasn't touched that area. For many people interested in historic preservation, that can be considered a good thing, but then parts of it are maybe slightly blighted.
Yes. Yeah, if people walk and they follow our map, so we've developed a walking path from the train station to the ferry. It's been sponsored by Care for the Cape, as well as, which is an organization that specifically gives grants to people who want to develop projects that unite tourism and caring for the Cape in a deeper way. And then we've also got the transportation people invested in this project. So the Regional Transit Authority as well as the High Line have invested in the printing of this map. And you're right, the neighborhood, when they follow the path, some people might think, why here? Because there's some properties that maybe haven't been maintained over the past decades, others that have been very carefully maintained. Why there is because cohesively together, this place has a fabric and an integrity. There's a lot of Gothic cottages that were sea captains' homes. Over 150 sea captains lived in Hyannis in the mid-1800s, and dozens of their homes are still there in this neighborhood. So just that alone is really interesting. But many people don't know that President Ulysses Grant spoke at the corner of Pleasant and Main to inaugurate the railroad when it was extended from Hyannis to Provincetown. He came from the vineyard on the River Queen, which alone is an amazing story, as it was the office during the Civil War for Grant and Lincoln. He came here and then traveled on the train from Hyannis to Provincetown, stopping at every stop, to lots of people cheering him on. So there's a lot of interesting tidbits that we want people to know about.
Definitely a forgotten story in the history. And Brian, you're a former longtime tree warden in Falmouth, and so I think you were telling me that there are some very interesting trees in this area as well. Isn't that right?
Yes, and it's my suspicion that many of these trees that are either in hedgerows between some of these properties as well as some of the street trees are actually remnants of trees that were brought over back in the 1800s by captains, seafaring captains from all parts of the world.
So what types of trees do we have in this area? And as you say, some of them might be a couple hundred years old. What types of trees?
So there's sycamore maple, and that is native to Europe, and also the copper beech, which is also native to Europe. And one other species that's actually native to North America, the butternut. And that's actually quite unusual that there are still healthy sections of butternut, because there is a blight that has affected the butternut. And there's really not all that many remaining butternuts pretty much in the eastern United States.
And so I was wondering how unusual this sort of grouping of trees is for you as a former tree warden. When you saw this, did you think right away, we've got some unusual things going on here?
Yeah, I did. I absolutely thought that, certainly these were indicative of plantings of sea captains back in this era.
And I guess what's interesting is this area is very close to the water, to the harbor, and so there would be a lot of effects from weather and salt, and yet the trees survived.
Right, and actually there is a lot of tolerance with this kind of, with these, especially two species of trees, the sycamore maple as well as the copper beech. They have salt tolerance, they have wind tolerance, so they were ideal plantings. And, that's what had happened. That's how they had planted them so close to the water.
And we were talking about how Pleasant Street and also School Street nearby, they're streets that go way back in the town's history, and you pointed out that tidbit about President Grant being there. And what are some of the other things that went on there?
Right. Well, people, whenever we walk around, we like to look at sort of the layers of meaning of a place. So even the idea that Old Colony Road, which is tangential, which is parallel to that street, do people know that the reason it's called the Old Colony Road is because the railroad tracks used to run right along that very path from the transportation center all the way down to Hyannisport. Right? So it's interesting to know when you're walking, imagine that that's where the train ran. So that's another interesting path. The map has other features on it that talks about the first property that was given by the Wampanoag Indians to the first white settler and business person, Nicholas Davis. And so it talks about his oystering in Lewis Bay, and what we know now to be Baxter's was actually the location of that first warehouse that was allowed to be built by a white settler, by the Wampanoags. And that sort of is one of the ending points on the map. You'd also pass the Cape Cod Maritime Museum along the way, which can fill in a lot of these facts as well, and is also one of our sponsors for this project.
And so this is really a self-guided walking tour, is that right? And people will be able to pick up this map in various places?
Yeah, so we're planning on having an inaugural handing out of them. We're going to meet the flyer, the commuter train that comes from Boston. And we're going to hand out the first 100 copies of these maps, and then you'll see lots of them appearing throughout the Cape in different locations at the Maritime Museum, at the ferry terminals, at the transportation center, et cetera, throughout the season.
I'm Laura Reckford, and this is Sunday Journal. I'm talking to Marianne Agresti, an architect here in Hyannis, and Brian Dale from the Cape Cod Regional Transit Authority about a new project here in Hyannis, a self-guided walking tour to the area around Pleasant Street in Hyannis from the transportation facility to the harbor. Does the map tell people the history of the area as well, or will there be plaques along the way? How will it all work?
Well, right now it's just a map. It's a small project. It's a volunteer effort with a small grant. But definitely our hope is that we will have a lot of momentum for interest in this place, and that therefore we could begin to get some grants and sponsorship for a plaque program. The map can also be accessed digitally, and we could develop in its next iteration, maybe an interactive map online. Right now, it's a rather traditional sort of paper copy that people can bring with them, hopefully keep with them. It's well illustrated, so it could be sort of a keepsake that they have from the Cape. When we hand it out at the Transportation Center, we really want to evoke this idea that this is how travelers came to Hyannis at the time that this map was made. Right? It was a big deal to come by train at that time. So we're going to be in costume, in period costume, handing out these maps, sort of evoking that era. And it's led to a lot of really interesting discussion about what our next project might be, which would actually be tracing this line of transportation in Hyannis and maybe even throughout the Cape. There's a wonderful story about public transportation in the Cape that we probably don't think much about right now because we drive everywhere and we kind of, but there's the evolution of the Cape as a destination was based a lot on the ferries and the railroad.
And this is really the second of the self-guided walking tours that are in the town of Barnstable, in Hyannis right now, because it was several years ago when the town actually put together a self-guided walking tour focusing on President John F. Kennedy and the Kennedy's family's long connection to the region. So there's that walking tour.
What I think is very different from me about these projects, what we're calling the spaces between, is that they're not pulled together by a category of interest like the Kennedys. What links them is that we're looking to actually connect again these ligaments that connect 2 points. What does it mean to go from one point to the next? I'm quite struck, having lived here for a relatively short time, about how quickly people move through certain areas and how there really isn't a lot of meaning attached to some of those places. Again, I think it goes back to often being in our cars, maybe thinking that it's not a pleasant walk, so we get in our car when it could have been quite easy to walk. So I really would like to I encourage people to, if they think of ideas, they could contact the Maritime Museum, who's our co-sponsor on this, and say, hey, I have an idea for a walk, because we'd like to develop a series of these so we can add another layer of meaning when people to connect the Cape for both the visitors as well as for the people who live here, who really don't know about a lot of these places.
Well, the great thing about this walk is you actually already have people taking the walk. They're pulling along their suitcases, and they've just come into the transportation facility there, and then they're going to the harbor to maybe take a ferry to Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard. They're actually walking there, and I'm sure they'll be able to pick up a map at the transportation center, and then they can perhaps look around as they're dragging their suitcase down the street and look around. And as you said, there's some very beautiful architecture on this street and several of those streets in that area.
Yeah. We've also added a few fun little glossary terms for families so the kid can carry the map and learn things along the way. So it could be, it's not anything that's going to take a lot of extra time. If you're headed to the ferry anyway, just grab one, and it's something to keep people busy while they're walking. That's definitely a feature that we get a lot of feedback from families saying, don't give us extra time, make sure that we can just do this on the way. So we're careful to do that. But I think really important to remember is that this is more than just a map, and this is more than just a walking tour, because behind it is a philosophy that as we look at how the Cape has developed and I know there's a lot of questions out there now about what the Cape should become. And for me, as an architect, I really wanted to bring awareness to what already exists and what we already have, and that some of the best development and some of the most sustainable decisions that are ever made are about taking care of and being very aware of what already exists and not necessarily always building new. And so a lot of these meaningful walks are about that awareness to me. So I think I'm hoping that as we continue to develop these projects, that's what will link them together.
And this idea of a place in between, and it's almost a hidden neighborhood. And we should point out that it's not really a long distance, and so anyone could take this walk. How long is the walk that you've charted out there?
I haven't measured it, but meandering would probably take you about 12 minutes, right?
Yeah, it's probably a quarter of a mile.
Yeah.
So it's a fairly short walk as well, and so anyone who's interested could take this little walk and pick up a map. Now, this is the very beginning of this project. What's sort of on the agenda with this project? What are you folks doing next?
Well, I'm starting to go to the towns with these to see, it's because this isn't necessarily all about Hyannis. I'd like to see if there's other places in towns, and people are very interested. They're saying, wow, I really like that idea. We do have some spots that are sort of forgotten connection points. So we're going to start gathering those to see which ones can be, dedicated to this project. and this idea of transportation and how that links the Cape. There's a lot of interest in that as well. And I think specific to this site, we're hoping that enough interest will develop in this neighborhood where we could begin to clean up the trees, develop the paths so the walking is much more inviting, encourage the private property owners to really be invested in their properties, those who haven't already, and maybe create a plaque program, maybe even have a block party. I'd love to throw a block party and close off Pleasant Street and really have everybody dress up like sea captains. So there's a lot of possibilities, I think, for all different factions of what we're trying to do in Hyannis, for both the residents as well as the visitors.
Now, how can people get involved and learn more about this? And perhaps people from other towns are thinking they'd like a walking trail in their town as well.
Right now, the most direct link to this map is through the Cape Cod Maritime Museum's website. They'll have a button on their masthead where you can easily access a digital version of this map. And then we're in the process of developing the spacesbetween.org. So it's just spacesbetween.org. And I'd say in a couple months that'll be up, and people can write suggestions for paths that they have, and we'll post all the work that we've done to date.
It's really a brand new project. This is really the first big conversation you've had talking about this publicly. So I'm really delighted you were able to make it in today to the show. And unfortunately, we're out of time. I've been talking to Marianne Agresti, an architect here in Hyannis, and Brian Dale from the Cape Cod Regional Transit Authority about a new project, a new walking tour here in Hyannis. Thank you so much to both of you for being with me here today.
Thank you very much, Laura.
I'm Laura Reckford, and this is Sunday Journal.
This podcast is a presentation of Cape Cod Broadcasting, which is solely responsible for its content. Thank you for listening. For more information, please visit us at capecodbroadcasting.com.